Hello, welcome to Rethinking the Six Wives of Henry VIII. This episode is all about Jane Seymour. So if you don't know who Jane Seymour was, she was the third wife of Henry VIII and she was mother to Edward, the future Edward VI. Now when we think of legacies that have surrounded Jane around the centuries and continues to this day, it's that she was the great love of Henry VIII's life, like a true fairy tale romance. But the reality is, it wasn't really the case. The way in which Henry treated Jane was not with the respect that she really deserved when she was alive, to be honest, and the idea of the great love of his life came pretty much with her death. Because of course Jane died after, not very long after giving birth to Edward. Edward was the boy, the prince, the legitimate son of Henry VIII. And it's from this that we have the legacy of the great love of his life. But was she really? Probably not. Instead of being remembered as the great love of Henry VIII's life, I have come up with 4 legacies that I think we should remember Jane by. Firstly, that she was different to his previous wives. Secondly, that she could play the game of courtly love. Thirdly, that she was a really brave woman. And fourthly, a woman that would stand up for her beliefs. So let's start with the first legacy. She was different. Now, being different is not a bad thing. Who wants to be a sheep? And her being different to his previous wives really worked in Jane's favour. Jane was fair, she was very pale, she had blue eyes and mousy coloured hair. Edward actually looked quite like Jane, whereas, say, Elizabeth looked like her father. She was very honest, she was virtuous, she was kind, and I'm not saying that neither Anne or Catherine were those things, but Jane made herself stand out as different. It was the Spanish ambassador Chapuis who said that Jane was of no great beauty or wit, but actually it was this that pushed her forward in Henry's affections. Henry was after a compassionate, a loyal, obedient wife. He didn't want the family background and connections of Catherine of Aragon. But he also didn't want the beauty, the wit and charm of Anne Boleyn. He wanted a wife more towards Catherine's side of the good queen. But what he didn't want was the family connections that she had behind her in case all went wrong. Now, Jane had been around court for a long time. She served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Now, because of her beauty, she hadn't captured Henry's heart before. But actually, she was being coached, and she was coached particularly well, into stand out as being different. Be as different looks-wise as Anne, and show your Englishness as different to Catherine. And this difference made Henry want her. And Henry thought, here is a good, suitable wife for me. She'll be back to the golden medieval queen. She'll be a mother of the people. She will be obedient. She will listen to me, and she may produce me an heir. And Jane, as her motto, took bound to obey and serve. Perfect for Henry. The second legacy I think Jane deserves is that she could play the game of courtly love. Now, courtly love, we talk about courtly love, but courtly love was actually a real thing. It was a real thing that was played. And the monarchs were the king and queen of courtly love. And courtly love was wonderful. Courting someone, writing poetry and gifts, etc. And I believe from courtly love, Henry first wanted Jane as a mistress at most. I don't think he first saw her and went, ooh, wife. He had decided to send Jane letters, as you do in courtly love. He sent her a letter, he sent her a purse of money. Now Jane had been coached and she knew what to do. She had been coached by her brothers, the very ambitious Seymours, we know them, Thomas Seymour, Edward Seymours, but she'd also been coached by Nicholas Carew, a Catholic, I should add. And she had been coached not only to differentiate herself in matters of looks, so she dressed in English dress, but also in matters of how to compose herself and be as virtuous as possible and be every inch the virgin. And so when Henry sent her a letter and a purse full of money, Jane kissed the letter and she sent it back with the money because she said she would not ruin her honour. It was a virtuous refusal and Henry accepted it. And it intrigued him because this was someone very different to his current wife, Anne. And it was this virtuous, this demureness which attracted Henry to her. And whereas Anne dressed in the French fashions, which although Henry did himself like, Jane wanted to show herself as completely opposite to Anne, so she dressed in the English style with gable hoods and English dress. And this again allured Henry because it was different and Jane was showing herself to be different. She was showing herself to be the complete opposite of Anne, and she was showing Henry that she could be the great medieval queen that he desires. The next legacy that I believe Jane deserves is that she was a real brave woman. Now by 1536, the start of the year, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, dies, and she dies in very sad circumstances. She doesn't get to see her daughter. Her husband is delighted at her death, which is quite sad. And of course, Henry VIII's current wife, Anne Boleyn, is sat on the throne, but their marriage is struggling. Anne had had a daughter, Elizabeth, but she had not been able to produce a living son. And as soon as the death of Anne Boleyn happens, Henry VIII becomes the most infamous monarch in Europe. By this time he is 44. He has banished and humiliated one wife and executed another. However, within 24 hours of Anne Boleyn's execution, Jane gets engaged to Henry. Within 11 days of the execution, they are married. Now, Anne stepped to her throne through fighting. She had to fight for that because it wasn't her throne to take, it was Catherine's. It was a long slug. The marriage went on trial. It was hard for Anne to get that crown, but she got it. All Jane had to do was be patient, show her difference, show her obedience, and be brave. And brave enough to step to her throne by Henry's side over the bloodshed that was not just Anne Boleyn, but the men that fell with her too. You've got to be a brave woman to marry a king just as he's executed his previous wife. I don't think I could. The last legacy that I believe Jane deserves to have is that she's a woman that stands up for her beliefs. Now, it's quite sad, really. Jane, of course, died very early. Because of this, we don't really know what type of life she would have had, what type of queen she would have made, what type of mother she would have made. Would she have had more sons with Henry? Would she have gone to have more children in general with Henry? What influence would she have upon Henry in the laws, in relationships? But in the short time that they were together, she did have some pretty interesting impact. Now, as I said previously, Jane had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, but Jane was Catholic and so was naturally on side of Catherine of Aragon. And something that Jane really desired was to have Catherine's daughter Mary back in the family fold. Henry himself hated to be questioned, especially by a woman. Now, Anne, of course, was known for doing this, and it kind of drove Henry wild with passion, but he was done with that now. No woman would ever speak to him that way again. Certainly not the next wife, Jane. And so whenever Jane brought up the prospect of Mary up in conversation, it was quickly shot down. Jane's idea was that Mary should be back in the family as a unit, but also back in the line of succession. Jane did persist with the topic of Mary, and she asked Henry about Mary, and he replied, "You should be begging for our children to be heirs." But he did have thoughts of over Mary, because he did love her. He was her pearl, and despite the difficulties that he had with his relationship with her mother, this was still his daughter and he did still love her. Now, Jane certainly did plant the seeds when it comes to Mary, because Mary got summoned to court, which you think would be a good thing, but not really. You see, Mary was summoned to court to surrender to her father in regards to him being the supreme head of the Church of England and the unlawfulness of her parents' marriage, which was something for Mary was a step too far. Initially, of course, Mary refused. Now, Mary was Catholic. Not only that, but she believed in the way that Catherine believed, which was that the marriage between Catherine and Henry could only be divided in death. And of course, being Catholic, her father being supreme head of the Church of England was just something she very much struggled with. However, Mary's refusal started this domino effect of people around her being sent to the Tower. And it did look at one point like Mary and Jane could also be heading that way too. And so Mary signed. And then, on the 6th of July, 1536, Henry met with Mary. And actually, they got on very well. And Mary was reintroduced back into the family. That was just one way in which Jane stood up for what she believed in. She believed that Mary should be back in the family, and she achieved it. It was brilliant. It was something that was divided when Anne Boleyn was in his eye line. But now she wasn't. Jane could undo that. And so she turned to her next point of call, which was really emotional for her, which was her religion. As I said, Jane was Catholic, and Henry was undergoing this reformation of the Church of England. Of course, he broke with the Church of Rome initially in order to marry Anne Boleyn. And Jane thought, would he undo all that for me? Well, the answer is simply no. By the autumn of 1536, the dissolution of the monasteries had begun, and the Pilgrimage of Grace had also begun, which was an uprising from the north of England, which was a rebellion in response to Henry and all the things that he'd recently done. So, making Mary illegitimate, the break with the Church of Rome. The people had just had enough, and this rebellion, led by Robert Aske, had begun, and the uprising started in the north of England and was moving forward. And Jane, being Catholic, she sympathised with these people from the Pilgrimage of Grace. And she herself got on her knees in front of Henry, and she said, "Perhaps God permitted this rebellion for ruining so many churches." Henry replied, "Don't meddle in my affairs, and remember Anne Boleyn." If that's not a warning, I don't know what is. And from this, Jane stepped back. She knew that was as far as she could push Henry. And so I often wonder how she felt, because she clearly showed that she was a woman to stand up for what she believed in, particularly around Mary, and she succeeded in that. She put Mary back within the family. But her faith, which was so important to her, did she herself feel like she failed in the Catholic cause? We don't know. But what I do think is really interesting is the short time that they spent together as man and wife. She actually achieved quite a bit. So imagine if she had lived. What else would she have achieved? So the next time you think of Jane Seymour, don't think of her as just the great love of Henry VIII's life. Think of her as a different woman who could play the game of courtly love to perfection. A woman who is brave and would stand up for what she believed in. So that is it for this documentary on Jane. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give it a big thumbs up. Chat to me in the comments all things Jane Seymour, and I shall see you soon for the next video. Bye for now.